And so, first of all, we have dark days for Judah. The northern tribes had experienced captivity beginning in 721. In 605, Nebuchadnezzar sieged Jerusalem. And if you ever read about a siege, you just say sieged Jerusalem. It sounds like he went in and took over. A siege was a big deal. They would surround the walled city, and they would just stay there until you starved out and had to come out. They just wouldn't let anybody in or out. And finally, all the provisions would be gone. And so he sieged Jerusalem. And the first wave of captives were carried away to Babylon, including Daniel and his three friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Now, you don't know them by those names, perhaps, but you know them by their Babylonian names. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. Daniel and these others, that's what I wanted to show you. It's about 900 miles from Jerusalem to Babylon. And the reason they don't go straight across the Arabian desert is because they would all die. The best way to go is north and then east and then back down from Jerusalem to Babylon. You remember Abraham was called out of Ur of the Chaldees. You see it down below Babylon there. And you remember he went north to Haran and stayed for a while, and that's where his father died. And then he came out of Haran and over to the west and down to the south, and eventually all the way to Egypt and back. But the only record I found of a significant crossing by a huge amount of people across the Arabian desert was, of course, you history buffs know, Alexander the Great took his army across there, and he surprised the enemy by how fast he could get to Jerusalem, but he lost hundreds of men and livestock and all in the process because the Arabian desert is not an easy thing to cross. And so most of them would go north and back down, a journey of about 900 miles. Now think about who's in this company. They go to Jerusalem and they ransack the city, and they take in this first, and we're going to read in just a minute, they take the choicest, the high-class people, the educated people, the royalty, the people who live in and around the palace, the people who are the upper echelon of their society. And what kind of life are those people used to? Kind of a cushy life. Now you're going to walk them for 900 miles. The cushy life is over. This is going to be a tough journey. And so I just thought that was interesting. So Daniel and the others. Let's start out reading Daniel chapter 1, beginning with verse 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand and some of the articles of the house of God. You remember those things that Solomon had made, and everything had a holy significance, those gold bowls and censers and all those things. They were very valuable. And so he took them from the house of God. He carried them into the land, verse 2, of Shinar to the house of his God, little g God, and brought the articles into the treasure of the house of his God. Now, God allowed this for a time, didn't he? God allowed Nebuchadnezzar. The overlying lesson, the thing that just blows you away about this, or does me, is God uses an extremely wicked king and empire to take his people into captivity for 70 years, and he allows them to ransack the temple and take these holy vessels and put them in the house of his God. His little g gods were not even real. I mean, they were figures, and so Jehovah allows this for the time. And he brought the articles in, verse 2, to the treasure house of his God. Then the king instructed Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, to bring some of the children of Israel and some of the king's descendants and some of the nobles, young men in whom there was no blemish, but good-looking, gifted in all wisdom, possessing knowledge and quick to understand, who had ability to serve in the king's palace, they might teach the language and literature of the Chaldeans. And so they are good looking with no blemish, gifted in wisdom and knowledge. They learn quickly. They can learn the language of the Chaldeans, and they're given the king's food and drink for 3 years of training. We'll read the rest of that in a minute. What little kind of side indicator tells you that Daniel learned the Babylonian Aramaic language quickly? What kind of tells you that? You remember we talked when we introduced the book in chapter 2 and verse 4, the book begins to be written in Aramaic, written by Daniel, written in Aramaic all the way over to chapter, 12 or something? I'll have to go back and look. I think chapter 12 and verse 7 is where the Aramaic ends. And so he learned the language. That was what he was living, and that was... so they were good-looking, no blemish, gifted. They had to be a certain quality to stand before the king. And there's still protocol when you approach a king or a president or an official. I know a lot of times Americans, when you see an American on the news that has actually gotten to meet the Queen, they are schooled in all kinds of things you do and you don't do when you stand before the Queen and all that. The Queen of England, I'm thinking. I know America doesn't have a queen. But when you stand before the Queen of England, there are certain things you don't do and certain things you do. And so they had to learn all these things. Now, they were part of the group of eunuchs, or the chief eunuch was in charge of them. A eunuch, of course, is an emasculated male who can be trusted around the king's family, around his wife and his daughters or whatever, and waits on them and takes care of them. And was Daniel a eunuch? The Bible never says he was. He did work under the chief of the eunuchs, which might be an indicator, but we never really know that for sure. Verse 3 is interesting. It says that they were of the king's descendants and some of the nobles, these young men who are brought forth, and they are, verse 5, the king appointed for them a daily provision of the king's delicacies and of the wine which he drank, and 3 years of training for them, so that at the end of that time they might serve before the king. Another indicator that he was probably about 15 is because by the time the training's finished, he's going to be 18, and that's a good, responsible age in that day and time when he could properly serve before the king. If he were any younger than that, he probably would not have been put in that position. We know that he served for about 70 years, 66 years, I think, till 539 when Cyrus took over, and he must have died around that time or shortly thereafter, and so he would have been there from the time he was 15 till about 85 in the captivity. And so he was probably, maybe, we talked about this in the introduction, might have been a descendant of David even, because he says the king's descendants and some of the nobles. David wasn't king then, but his lineage was, and his fingerprints are all over the place in the kingdom in Jerusalem, and so could have been. Questions or comments about this first part? Anything? Anything I left out that you need to know? How would you know? Interesting. All right. These 4 young men are going to be the center characters of of Daniel's the first 6 chapters anyway. It's going to kind of center around them and Nebuchadnezzar. The first is Daniel. His name is God is my judge, and they changed his name to Belteshazzar, protected by the gods, or Bel, the god of the Babylonians, protected by God. Now, let me give you a disclaimer. You know how on television they run that little disclaimer at the bottom? I looked these Babylonian names up in 6 different sources, and I got 6 different answers about what they meant. And so, I'm not sure. You may say, well, my study Bible says it means something besides Baal protects him. I guarantee you it does. It says that. Because I studied 6 different ones, and they all said Bible dictionaries and encyclopedias and those kinds of things. So this is the best I can come up with. Hananiah meant the Lord is gracious, and his name Shadrach had something to do with the sun god. The sun god is, or he is the God. And Mishael, who is God, they changed his name to Meshach, which had to do with moon god. The Babylonians, of course, had little g gods for everything. Azariah, the Lord helps, and his name may be probably as significant even as Daniel's. They changed his name to Abednego, which means servant of Nebo, and Nebo is the god of learning and literature for the Babylonians. And so they had to learn the literature of the Babylonians and the Chaldeans, and so it may be that his name had significance in that sense. But you have these 4 choice young men. I don't know if I'm doing a good job of getting you to wrap your mind around what's going on here. They had lived their whole lives up till teenagers in a pretty good life in Jerusalem. They were Jews. They were used to all of the old law type things. And they, all of a sudden, they're taken away on a 900-mile journey to a land I am pretty sure none of them had ever been. And a whole new culture they have to learn. Now, I would think a teenager could learn it easier than a 50-year-old and adjust to it easier than a 50-year-old, but they have to. And so these 4 do it quite well because what did they take with them that Nebuchadnezzar could never strip them of? What did they take from Jerusalem with them? Their faith. Their faith. He could never take their reliance upon God and their faith in God. Now, we, Doug Mansfield and I had this, discussion after our last class. I mentioned that there may be a time, I don't know, I'm not an expert, but I mentioned there may be a time when the United States as we know it doesn't exist. And Doug and I talked about that, and you know, there may be a time when, and I don't know, there may be a time when God says, you know what, enough's enough. And we change the scenery drastically. But here's something I learned from Daniel, and something I know for sure, is that if I continue to stay faithful, even if it means my death, God's going to take care of it. And so God, the big lesson from this that I really have trouble getting people to see is, this is a drastic, catastrophic, traumatic change in the lives of these young men, yet their faith makes it possible for them to endure it. Their faith in God, and God did not forget them, did He? God stayed with them through the whole thing. Now, Daniel made a decision. He purposed in his heart not to defile himself. Let's start reading about verse 6. When we finish verse 5, the king had appointed them a daily provision of the king's delicacies and of the wine which he drank, and 3 years of training, so that at the end of time they might serve the king. Now, from among those, the sons of Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And to them the chief of the eunuch gave names. He gave Daniel the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah Shadrach, to Mishael Meshach, and to Azariah Abednego. And Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's delicacies, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the chief of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Now God, listen to this, God had brought Daniel into favor and goodwill of the chief of the eunuchs. What about the king's delicacies and his drinks could be considered by Daniel, a Jew, to be a defilement? What are some of the possibilities? We're not told. But you remember the Jewish strict dietary laws? You remember in Leviticus and in Exodus when they were coming out and God gave them the law of Moses, and there were things they could eat and things they couldn't eat. It could be that the king was asking them to eat things that were unclean for a Jew and a Jewish person, and Daniel wouldn't do that. One commentator speculated that it could possibly be they were asking them to eat things offered to idols, And of course, 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and Romans 14 both say that if it doesn't offend anybody, there's nothing to anything offered to an idol. A Christian could eat something that had been offered to an idol as long as he didn't do so in worship to the idol. But in this setting, it may be that those around would think that these men with these Babylonian names, honoring Babylonian gods, are eating things offered to idols. Maybe they would think they were worshiping those idols. That's a possibility. And they don't want to do anything to cause that. Now, application in our lives. There are some things that Paul said, all things are lawful for me, but not all things are expedient. There are some things that as an American I'm allowed to do. And boy, we like our rights, don't we? I have a right to do that. But it may not always be wise to exercise that right. It may be that sometimes for the cause of Christ, I might have to step back and say, you know what, I don't have to do that to live. And so it's going to offend somebody, going to cause somebody to fall away, or going to cause somebody to not listen to me as I'm trying to teach them the gospel because of this particular habit or this particular thing or whatever. I need to abstain from that. And so it could be that. But Daniel is not going to partake of these things. And I love that phrase, he purposed in his heart. He decided, you know what, God, I'm not going to do this. I know it doesn't please you, and I'm simply not going to do it. And Revelation 2 and verse 10 comes to mind. Be faithful even if it means you're dead. Alan? He could, if he were a practicing Jew and they were asking him to eat something that was unclean for Jews, he couldn't do it. And that's probably what it was. Or it could have been, as I said, something offered to an idol, and he didn't want to do that because he didn't want them to think he was worshiping the idol. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Now, in our day and time, it wouldn't apply so much except for the influence idea. You might eat something that would influence a weak person negatively. That's what Romans 14 is about. But you remember Peter saw the sheep coming down with all the stuff in it, and he said, I can eat anything I want to. So in our day and time, there probably wouldn't be an unclean food, but it could be an unclean circumstance where I don't want to exercise this right because I don't want to influence this person negatively, and I don't want to shine a bad light on what God would have me to do. Notice how Daniel purposes, how he carries this out. By the way, he's a young prisoner of war. When you're a prisoner of war, you're at the mercy of whom? Your captors. and Nebuchadnezzar was not shy about taking somebody's head, about having somebody's head taken off for disobedience. And so Daniel purposed in his heart he would not defile himself with the portions of the delicacies, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested. He didn't get up on his pulpit and stomp and shout and sweat and foam at the mouth and say, I'm not eating that nasty stuff. He requested of the chief of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. He explained, in my mind, this would defile me. This would make me unclean. And so I'd rather not do it. God had brought Daniel into favor with him, which was a good thing. The chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my Lord and the king who has appointed your food and drink. Why should he see your faces looking worse than the young men who are your age? Then you would endanger my head before the king. You see what he's saying? If you don't look as good as these others, the king's going to have my head. And so why would I allow you to do that? And then Daniel is persistent, verse 10. Or verse 11, Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days, and let them give us vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance be examined before you, and the appearance of the young men who eat the portion of the king's delicacies, and as you see fit, so deal with your servants. You know what he was willing to do? He wasn't only persistent, he was willing to put his faith to the test. Are you good at that? Are we good at putting our faith to the test? We're not required to as much as he would have been, but there are times when compromise would seem to be the easier of the two choices. And every time I have ever put my faith to the test, God has passed in flying colors, and he always will. Every time I've ever had to stand toe-to-toe with something not like this, but something that would test my faith, I would simply say something like, God, here we go. You know, it's up to you. And he would take care of it. And it always is that way. I tell you, and I don't know, this is a silly illustration to some of you probably. I have this trailer that I pull behind my Tahoe or behind my truck, and a handy little 8-foot wide, 12-foot long utility trailer. And I haul lawnmowers and bicycles and all kinds of things on it. Well, I went down to Russell County a while back on vacation for a week, and I pulled that thing all over the place because I was afraid if I unhooked it and left it, somebody'd steal it. So everywhere we went, Cumberland Falls, the fish hatchery at Wolf Creek Dam, over to Columbia, over to Russell Springs, everywhere I went, I pulled this thing. And pulled it on, and I bought it new in 2006, and I put bearings in it once, 2 years ago. And so I pulled it all over the place, came back way up in the night with Gene and the boys, and got all the way home, parked the thing, and didn't think any more about it, unloaded it, and let it sit there for a while. Well, I had some stuff on it I wanted to throw in the dumpster over at the camp, and so I took it over there Thursday, and threw the stuff in the dumpster, and pulled away, and the left wheel fell off on the highway. The bearing was so bad and the axle had been so worn that I didn't even notice. Apparently the thing was just wobbling all over the place. And I had been on the interstate. I'd been all over southern Kentucky. I'd been all over the place, and the thing fell off. I don't know about you, but I think Providence has something to do with that kind of stuff. And I don't know if God said, hey, Jerry, you're in trouble. I'm going to hold this wheel on for you until you figure out you got to have a bearing. You know, who knows? But those things always seem to work out. And so put your faith to the test. God always handles his end of the bargain. He always does. That's what he did with Daniel. Jesus talked about testing your faith, and the easy one, the one to come up with right away, is Matthew 6. Don't worry about tomorrow. Let tomorrow worry about its own things, because God knows you need these things, food, shelter, and clothing, and he's going to take care of them. Have you ever put him to the test on that? God, we're down to the wire. We're going to need something here. And then I've had people tell me when the church helped them with various things like electric bill or something, and usually the ones that didn't ask. You would help somebody and they would say, you know what, I've been praying about it and I knew God would take care of it, I just didn't know from where it would come. And it seems like these things have to work out. Well, that may be pale in comparison to what Daniel was going through, but anyway, Daniel, he put his faith to the test. He said, you look at us in 10 days, and if we're not as good or better than those who are eating the king's food, then you do whatever you want to us. Well, now one of the things that he would have done is maybe change their diet. The other thing he could have expelled them from the program, and life would not be great if he did that. The result, verse 14, he consented with them in this matter and tested them 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, their features appeared better and fatter in flesh than all the young men who ate the portion of the king's delicacies. Thus, the steward took away their portion of delicacies, and the wine that they were to drink, and gave them vegetables. And now, there is some controversy about what happened here. You read a whole bunch of different things, and you talk to preachers you trust and appreciate and all that. There's some thought that where this says God took away their portion, or the steward, verse 16, took away their portion of the delicacies, the there, T-H-E-I-R, may refer to all the other ones being trained. It may refer to the idea that he changed them all to water and vegetables. And they all fared well. Some people think that. Either way, they were blessed, and it affected the lives of all of them. They appeared fatter in flesh than the young man who ate the king's delicacies. And he goes on to say that God gave them wisdom and knowledge. He blessed them. Verse 17, as for these four young men, God gave them knowledge and skill in all literature and wisdom. And Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. And at the end of the days, when the king had said that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. The king interviewed them, and among them all, none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore, they served before the king, and in all matters of wisdom and understanding about which the king examined them, he found them, these four, 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers who were in all his realm. Not just the young ones being trained, but all the older ones. Of course they're better because they have a direct line to Jehovah himself. Of course they're going to be better. And so Daniel continued in the court of the Babylonians for nearly 70 years. They were to serve in the king's palace and be taught the language and literature of the Chaldeans. They were given special provisions of the king's food and drink. They were trained for 3 years, and God took care of them because they would not defile themselves. They were polite. He didn't demand. He was polite when he approached and asked about these things. He did it with God's help. Verse 9, God gave him favor in the eyes of the chief of the eunuchs. And does that remind you a little bit of another Old Testament character? Joseph, maybe? Every time I read Daniel, I think about Joseph. I think, man, his brothers sold him. I got 2 brothers, and I've entertained the idea a time or two. And they have too. They have too, no doubt. But his brother sold him into slavery, and he was taken to Potiphar's house where he was falsely accused and thrown into prison, and yet God fixed all that. God took care of all of it. And Daniel, taken as a prisoner of war to a foreign land, and God just took care of him, even in that circumstance. And so he did it through persistence. He was willing to test his faith, and the value of such faith is seen in its results. He continued on. Well, how about us? Keeping your commitment to the Lord. Be polite. I've shared this little... there's never any reason to be rude or arrogant. Proverbs 15:1, a soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. I've shared this little mantra with you for several times. I have tried to live by this little thing for over 30 years, probably 32 or 3 years, that I discovered that this worked for me. And I keep it before me a lot. My philosophy, my mantra for life is be right, be nice, and be fearless and firm. Be sure you got your ducks in a row. Be sure you're on the right side. Be sure you've understood the Scripture properly, or whatever it is that you're discussing. Be sure you're right, but you don't have to be ugly about it. Be nice. There's no reason to fight and argue about things. Be nice. But if you have your ducks in a row, if you are right, and if you have approached it politely and nicely, don't let that be mistaken for weakness. Don't let them back you up. Be firm and fearless. If you're on the right side, you're on the right side. And so that reminds me, Daniel is just the epitome of that, isn't he? He was right, and he was polite, he was nice, but he wasn't afraid of anything. He was going to do what he was going to do. And he sought God's help. Psalm 127 in verse 1, unless the Lord builds a house, they labor in vain who build it. And everything they try to do will be vain unless God is in control. Be persistent. Matthew 7 and verse 7 is the place where Jesus said, ask and it will be given unto you, seek and you shall find, knock and the door will be opened unto you. Every one of those are in a continual tense. Keep on asking, keep on seeking, keep on knocking. And you will receive and you'll find that you have doors open to you. Doors will be open for you. The parable of the persistent widow in Luke chapter 18 and verse 1 and following. You remember this widow just kept bringing her petition before this man. And finally he said, well, I'm going to have to grant it or she's not going to shut up. I'm going to have to finally deal with her. Jesus was teaching that we need to be persistent. And then, of course, old Malachi. We studied the minor prophets a few months ago. Malachi told them about testing their faith. God himself said to the people of Malachi's day, put me to the test. You do the tithing the way it ought to be done, and I'll open the windows of heaven and pour out blessings more than you could ever imagine. You couldn't handle it. Put me to the test. You know, guys, you folks, sorry, you're not all guys. Folks, you either believe this or you don't. That God sees everything. He sees you. He knows you. He loves you. He's interested in you. He's interested in what you have to do and what you go through. And I know sometimes the difficulties persist for so many years, or to the point that you're thinking, I think he might have forgotten about me. He hasn't. You be faithful and he'll take care of them. Be willing to test your faith. Okay, we got about 6 minutes, and so that's plenty of time. Daniel purposed not to defile himself. So can we. You don't have to compromise with this world. You don't have to. You don't have to curse. You don't have to drink. You don't have to be a drug addict. You don't have to be like them in order to win them. People baptize people all the time who are totally different from them. And so you don't have to defile yourself. I baptized this old boy up in Indiana, and he was there every time the doors were open. One Wednesday night he missed, and he was a recovering alcoholic. I'm not picking on those of you who are recovering from that, but he was, and he'd done pretty well for quite a while. But he missed one Wednesday night, and I called him. He was a good friend too, still is. I called him the next day. I said, Russell, where were you last night? He said, well, some friends of mine were going down to the bowling alley and drinking and bowling. And he said, I thought instead of coming to church, I could do more good going down there with them and maybe influencing them for Christ. And I said, well, how'd that work for you? And he said, well, not too good, so I've got an awful hangover this morning. and so that doesn't always work. You don't have to, you don't have to defile yourself. He did straighten up and do a little better. He still has his moments. Daniel was persistent in his service to God. Don't be one of those, I'm in today and out tomorrow. I was telling somebody the other day, and I hesitate to even use myself as an example because it looks like I'm saying, look, I'm Superman. I'm not. But the church has been my life. Serving the Lord has been my life for a long time. And I've never regretted that. I try to be persistent and consistent in my service to God. And so I've never regretted that. And I don't think Daniel regretted it. I don't think Paul regretted it. And I don't believe you will. Daniel refused to compromise regardless of the consequences. Now, when we get over to chapter 6, when he's thrown into the lion's den, or chapter 3, when the children of Israel, the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are thrown into the furnace, man, if there was ever a time you're going to compromise, that would be the time when you were tested to do so, because your very life is on the line, like the apostles in the first century. And then prayer. Daniel had complete and continual trust in God. Complete. Let that sink in. Complete trust in God. I know God knows what He's doing. And I know He always will. Questions, comments? All righty. Next week we get into an exciting chapter, chapter 2, where Nebuchadnezzar sees a big statue. Thank you for your comments.